We'll try this. So I'm gonna be more comfortable if I stand up, if you guys are okay with that.
It's nice.
So was the other bee person, it's so interesting. The other bee person wanted to
Yeah.
stand up too, it's very interesting.
We don't spend a lot of time sitting down. So, should we go ahead?
Yes, yeah, go right ahead.
Thanks for waiting while we did the technology. I've prepared a whole bunch of slides, maybe more than we'll be able to get through, but we'll try and really move through them quickly for the science. And you should feel free, I'm here to explain what you want to know about background pollinator issues. So if what I'm covering is not what you wanted to hear, ask questions, I'm happy to answer them. Make sense? So I thought I'd start with some background on honeybees. Has anybody kept bees? Is anybody familiar with how managed honeybees work in a colony?
My good friend kept bees, so I.
Okay, so
Andrew, I'm sorry to interrupt too. If we could just have you state your name for the record and where you're from and.
sure. My name's Andrew Moncris. I'm from Cornwall, Vermont, which is outside of Middlebury, for those of you that don't know. And I'm the owner and operator of Lemon Fair Honeyworks, which operates in Addison County. And I'm on the board of the Vermont Beekeepers Association, and I'm here representing them today. And when you have a honeybee hive, we tend to speak of that as a colony because it's a queen, and all of the workers and all of the drones in that colony are her children. And so it's a family. The hive is actually the boxes that the colony is housed in. And so we'll refer to colonies, and it's the same thing as what a layperson might call a, there we go, what a layperson might call a hive. And so we're going to talk a lot about foraging bees today because it's the foragers that get into trouble. They go out, they look for food, they're gathering nectar, they're gathering pollen. This is a worker bee that's carrying a lot of pollen on her claviculae, which are pollen baskets on her legs. The pollen is the protein source that the bees use. I guess it's just responding slowly. Okay. The bees are collecting the pollen as a protein source for the larva, but the incredible value of the fact that they gather pollen as a food source is that they pollinate crops, both intentionally and unintentionally. Now, obviously, in Vermont, we've got apples, we've got blueberries. There's some guys from Vermont that are migratory and they'll travel to Massachusetts to do cranberries or to Maine to do low bush blueberries. But in Vermont, most of the larger orchards can't rely on native pollinators solely because the acreage is too big. And so they're bringing in managed honeybee colonies. Home gardeners, market gardeners, all of those places are relying on both native pollinators and managed pollinators for pollination. The honey obviously is another product that the bees produce. We do sell honey. Most beekeepers sell honey. For some of us, that's the main focus. For others, that's kind of a sideline, and pollination is the main thing. And there's a lot of what we call incidental pollination taking place any place somebody is keeping managed pollinators. The bees will fly 2 to 4 miles in any direction, and they pollinate people's gardens and people's farms. They pollinate crops and fields and the bushes in your backyard. When the honeybee colony is kept in a managed hive situation, state law requires it to be on removable frames so that it can be inspected for health and disease. That's what you see going on here. The wooden frames contain a starter sheet, which the bees build out to hold beeswax comb, and it becomes both the place the bees live and also where they store their food. And what you're looking at here, this will become relevant later, so excuse the science lesson. These are seal larvae. So honeybees as insects undergo metamorphosis when they go from a larva, basically a grub, to a fully mature winged insect. What you're looking at here are the grubs, or what we call the larval stage. They go through 5 instars as a grub, and then they undergo metamorphosis, and eventually they chew their way through the wax capping, and they become a fully adult bee that can fly, that can sting, that can pollinate, that can gather nectar. And around the larva, you see cells that have kind of a colored pasty substance in it, that's pollen. The pollen is only consumed by the larva. The nectar is mixed with the pollen to make a brood food that's fed to the developing larva. And that's critical because contaminants in the pollen will affect the developing larva, just like contaminants in a jar of baby food are going to infect a human infant. Make sense? The nectar is the only feed that the adult bees need. It's basically carbohydrates, pure carbohydrates. It gives them the energy to fly, gives them the energy to do what they need to do. But you can't build a bee, can't raise a larva without protein. So that's where the pollen comes in. Here's a better example with caproot, open brood or larva, a nice band of pollen. And then you can see this says honey, but technically this is still nectar until it's capped when it's dry enough that it can be preserved basically indefinitely for use. And the reason the bees are collecting nectar and the reason they collect excess nectar is because they need to survive the winter. And there's no flowers blooming from about October on. And so they store large quantities of honey to get them through the winter. But they cannot raise brood in the wintertime. And again, this will come into play later when we talk about honeybee survival. They need the bees that are born in September and August need to live all the way through the winter until the following spring. And in the summer, those same bees are only living for 5 weeks, and then they're being replaced. So the winter bees are morphologically different than the summer bees, and they're able to live for 5 or 6 months rather than 5 or 6 weeks. Make sense there? We also have, you asked me to speak about pollinators, and obviously my area of expertise is honeybees, but we do have plenty of native pollinators that do a lot of pollinating in Vermont. And this gives you a little sense of how many species we have. There's 350 native species of pollinators in Vermont. And this shows you where they're most heavily concentrated. Obviously, along the spine of the greens, there aren't as many, just like there's no managed honeybee colonies there. A little forage on. The terrain is rough. They don't survive very well there. And they're concentrated in the Champlain Valley and the other arable valleys, which incidentally is also where agriculture is most heavily concentrated. Now, to understand the health of pollinators, you have to choose a metric by which to determine whether the pollinators are healthy or not. And the overall number of honeybee colonies is not a particularly useful metric because they're managed by beekeepers. And I'll talk a little bit later about how we propagate bees, how we replace colony losses. The migratory operations go to the south and spend the winter propagating bees, and they can bring a larger number back after propagating in the south where it's warm all year. The native pollinators obviously don't have the opportunity to have somebody managing them and replacing them. But it's also harder to keep track of the numbers of the native pollinators because you have to go looking for them rather than simply counting the colonies that you have. It's typical to use honeybees as a proxy for native pollinators. So if the honeybees are dying, you can generally assume that the native pollinators are dying at about the same rate. And this is a nonpartisan group called the Bee Informed Partnership. As you can tell, they work nationally. And what we're looking at here is the average total annual colony loss, which if you go up here and you look at Vermont, is averaging about 57%. So that means that 57% of the managed honeybee colonies are dead at the end of the year. And you'll see other statistics that are winter loss. Unfortunately, these days we're losing colonies all year round. So the number that you lose over the winter is only a fraction of the total of what you're going to be losing. Now, to put that in perspective, you can imagine a dairy farm that's got 300 cows. And what this would be like is if in the spring you went out to your barn and there were only 120 cows left. So it's pretty grim. Beekeepers spend a lot of time cleaning out dead boxes of bees in the spring. I've done that a huge amount. It's very depressing. And so from my point of view, I would say that the honeybees certainly are not doing well. And obviously, as you can see, from this chart, that's a nationwide problem that's going on around the country.
Andrew, can you, I think maybe we saw a chart like this the other day, possibly. Can you tell us what time frame this captures and whether if we were to see,
Yeah, this captures the last 4 years. And what you'll see is that it swings widely. About as low as it goes for annual loss these days is about 35 to 38%. And there's a year in here where it was up closer to 80%, which skews it pretty high. And what you have is a bunch of, I mean, we'll talk more about the causes later, but you can get outlier years when a number of factors come together to cause an extreme loss event.
Representative Pearl?
I'm just curious about bees, what's an accepted loss, what's the lifespan of a bee as far as, is that a?
Yeah, so we don't really think of the bees as the organism because honeybees are what you call a superorganism. And so the bees, like I said, they only live about 5 weeks, so you don't mourn the loss of an individual bee.
I get
But
that.
a colony should exist somewhat in perpetuity. They've evolved to have a mechanism by which they can replace the queen. And before all of the factors that are currently affecting the health, the colony would continue to exist year after year. Even as the bees within it would change, the queen would be replaced maybe after 3 or 4 years. What we're seeing now is queens are living maybe 6 months, 9 months, and colonies aren't surviving more than a year. You're lucky if you get a colony through a couple of years. Yeah.
Representative Lipsky?
Yeah, thank you. I know there's always outliers, but what strikes you about Colorado, Nebraska, and Washington State, who are in the sort of mid to low 20s? What's going on there? Do you have any sense of?
Yeah, I've looked at this
why they're doing better?
Tennessee is another one
Yeah,
that's extremely high.
high on the other.
And what I'm guessing, especially when you look at the western states, is we're seeing extreme weather events being combined with all of the other environmental factors that are affecting bees. So in any agricultural state, you're dealing with the loss of habitat and with pesticides, plus with the standard pathogens that are affecting bees. And then if you have a systemic drought, where like in the West, they've been having drought over a decade, that's going to affect the health of the bees as well because of poor nutrition. I'm not an expert on bees in other states, but that's basically what's going on. Okay. So yeah, this is a 4-year average. And if you have any interest in doing any further research, you can go to the Bee Informed Partnership and you can see the statistics for an even longer period than that. So how is it that there's still honeybees in Vermont? Well, the fact is that beekeepers have become bee replacers. And so we've all gotten very good at making more colonies. Like I said, when you have managed colonies of pollinators, the beekeeper can propagate them and make replacement. But this comes at a cost. There's kind of 2 ways you can replace your bees. This is what's called splitting, where you take a colony that's in a hive and you basically divide it in half. And you take the half that doesn't have the queen in it after you've divided it and you introduce a queen in there. And by doing that, you can make 2 colonies. Now, obviously, each of them is half as big as the original colony. So you do that at a loss of honey production. The saying among beekeepers is you can either make bees or you can make honey. So if you choose to split your colonies, you're delaying their growth such that they're unlikely to be able to capture maybe the first half or maybe the whole season of the nectar flow, which means that your income from that colony that year is very close to 0, or you might make just a little bit. But you've made a replacement colony. When it becomes a problem is when you lose half your colonies year after year. Because if you split the remaining half of your colonies to get your numbers back to where they were, you're right back where you were, but you didn't make very much honey, which is how you make your profit. And then the following year, you lose half your bees again. So that's not sustainable in the long term. And what we're seeing is businesses that have been, they're in the 4th generation of management now are questioning if they can keep going. Now, one solution is you can leave. And so there are beekeepers who only keep their bees here for maybe 4 or 5 months in the summer. And then they get exposed to pesticides, they, collect contaminated pollen, and they can move to the south to big areas of pine barrens, and they can spend the winter rebuilding the bees, and then they can bring them back. And they can maybe split them twice during what would be our winter, and they can bring back the same numbers that they started with, because they can get a jump on the spring season. Those of us that stay here year round can't do that. We can't even open a colony of bees to manage them unless it's above 50 degrees outside. So our management ends usually in October, and we usually can't touch the bees again until April without risking, them getting chilled and dying. So replacement by splitting your own has its limitations. When losses were down in the 10 to 20% range, it was an extremely viable way. You only had to split 10% or 20% of your colonies to get right back where you were. You could produce honey with the rest, and you could keep going. The other way you can replace your bees is to buy packages of bees. These are produced in the deep south, and they're simply loose bees shaken into a crate, shipped up here. And currently a nucleus colony like the ones I showed you where you split a hive in half, a half-size nucleus colony is worth about $200, and a package of bees is around 150. So if you were to have an operation that has, say, 1,000 hives, which is maybe a little bit on the small side for a commercial operation, but we use it because it's a nice round number, and you lose half your bees every year, you're looking at either an expense or the loss of income equal to $100,000. And we use our own nucleus colonies to replace our winter losses. But I used to sell them back before the bees died every. And I can't sell bees anymore. I might be lucky if I sell 5 or 10, and we used to sell hundreds. And there's a market for them. People really want to purchase bees. The north is a great place to raise bees, but they're all getting vacuumed up to replace the winter losses. And in extremely bad years, we've had to purchase packages from the deep south to replace the bees that have been lost, which is something we don't want to do. We don't want those genetics. But sometimes you have no choice. So why is it that the bees are dying? Well, this is the standard list that you see: climate change, habitat loss, parasites, and pathogens, and pesticides. And I'll say the first two are true, but they're not causing 50% losses. That's been going on for quite a while. The bees can evolve to deal with changing climate. I mean, bees made it through the ice age. They've been around for 100 million years, so they can evolve to deal with these things. The parasites and pathogens, we're basically talking about a couple of pathogens that affect the health of the bees and a particular parasite, which is deadly. And the pesticides obviously are designed to kill insects. And as a beekeeper, I'm an insect farmer. And so I'm trying to raise an animal that other farmers are trying to kill, or at least is in the same class as other insects that are being killed by pesticides. And so we get caught up as collateral damage. So obviously you understand it's pretty hard to make honey when the fields are all underwater like they were this summer. So that's climate change for you. And it's pretty hard to make honey when they're paving the hay fields for subdivisions. But like I say, those are minor. There's plenty of, especially in Vermont, there's lots of areas that are above water and are still hay fields and pastures and wildflowers. So there's plenty of forage here still for bees. So then we're looking at pests, pathogens, and pesticides, the 3 Ps. So this is a varroa mite on a honeybee. That's sort of like a tick that feeds on honeybees. And they were introduced from Southeast Asia back in the 80s, accidentally. And they were originally a parasite of an Asian honeybee, which is a different subspecies. And so they aren't very well adapted to the honeybee. So they do tend to make their host sicker than if they'd evolved with a parasite-host relationship over thousands of years. If you were the size, well, if a bee was the size of you, that mite would be the size of a dinner plate. So that gives you the sense of how big they are. That's what they look like. And you can't really have a discussion about honeybee health without talking about mites. But beekeepers have gotten pretty good at managing the mites. There's organic techniques, there's chemicals, there's rendering colonies queenless. Like I say, the mites have been around since the 80s, and post-mite colony losses were typically below 10%. So the mites are not the main factor that we're looking at here. This is a page of my results. We participate in the APHIS National Honeybee Survey, which is administered by UVM in Vermont. And what this gives you is the total number of mites that were in the sample of bees that you have, the load of mites that you have per 100 bees. It tells you your nosema load, and on the next page, it'll tell you how many viruses you have in. I'll apologize for getting off into the weeds here, but I am going to loop this all around. And if you don't catch all the science, ask me questions, or just go with the flow. It will all connect. Nosema and virus are two things that affect the health of the honeybees in a small way, but unfortunately, when they're combined with pesticide exposure, they affect the bees in a big way. And I'll show you some data on that in just a second. You can see from this sample here, we have 4 mites in 1,000 bees. And you start getting worried when you have 4 mites in 100 bees. So this is not a level to be concerned about. The nosema load similarly is extremely low. And you can see here the virus levels are extremely low. But these are some of dozens of viruses that can affect the bees. But well-managed colonies will have low levels of mites, low level of viruses. So then how come the bees are still dying? Well, because we've introduced a new class of pesticides, and their increase in use pretty much mirrors the increase in the decline of pollinators in general and honeybees in particular. And if you want to look a little closer, I've got samples here. 99% of the corn in Vermont is treated with neonicotinoid seeds. And somewhere around 35% of the soybeans. So here we've got some soybeans. That's a powdered seed coating, and that's a systemic pesticide. And what a systemic pesticide is, it means you can fill the whole plant with pesticide by simply putting it on the seed. And as the plant grows, it's absorbed into the tissue of the plant because the particles are so small. And it's expressed in every cell of that plant, which includes the nectar and it includes the pollen. Now, of that seed coating that you see, somewhere around 2 or 3% of that is absorbed into the plant. And the rest of it is either lost into the air while it's being planted as dust, or it's absorbed into the soil and the water that's in the field. So again, we'll come back to that in a minute. In Vermont, there's about 86,000 acres of corn planted, and the acreage of soybeans has also been increasing. And so because every cell of these plants is now full of pesticide, and because it's in the soil, the whole field then becomes toxic to pollinators. There's a field of soybeans. So what does that look like? Well, here's an aerial view of this one is around Addison County. And what we have here, the highlighted areas, which are red, are corn, purple are soybeans. And the circles represent the flight radius of registered apiaries that are in that location. So when I was talking about this with the Agricultural Innovation Board last year, one of their initial suggestions was, well, why don't you just move the bees away from the fields that are treated with pesticides? Then you won't have a problem. The problem is the distribution of the fields is extremely widespread. And so if you look at the state, you can see how extensive it is. Any area that isn't highlighted is red. it's also not an area where you would be able to keep bees because it's mountainous or it's dense woods, and there's not enough forage in the dense woods to keep honeybee colonies alive. They need blooming flowers, trees bloom in the spring, and that's it. So you'd have food for 2 weeks in the spring, and then that would be it.
Are there no, so there are no circles up in the upper right?
We'll go back in a second. Yeah, so there's either no bees here, or what I'm thinking, I asked a master's student at UVM to put this together for me who had GIS experience. And I think she only included the ones over here in the main valley. I know there are some apiaries up here, but these valleys are extremely narrow. And it's much harder to keep bees up in the kingdom than it is out in the Broad Valley, just because of that lack of forage. But I'm sure there are apiaries up there. There might also be an issue where some of the kingdom beekeepers have an attitude where they don't necessarily maybe want to tell the state that it's bees from.
Oh,
Just guessing. So anyway, this gives you a sense, various areas of Vermont and how prevalent fields are that are treated with neonicotinoid pesticides. And we talked about pollinators declining over the past several years. It's been about 20 years. And if you look at this graph, you can see that while the actual pounds per acre of pesticides being applied has decreased, the toxicity of the pesticides being used has increased. Neonicotinoids in particular, 1 teaspoon of that seed treatment on those, in those jars, would be enough to kill every single honeybee in Vermont. That's how toxic it is, okay? And so we're using fewer pounds, but the toxicity of each acre is increasing. Now, they stopped collecting data in 2014, but that curve would keep climbing up. And if you look at the class of pesticides, you can see the blue is neonicotinoids. And you can see how that's really taken off. And what we saw starting around 2007, 2008, we started wondering, we started having losses maybe in the 40% range, which had never happened before. Even when the varroa mites first came, never happened before. People started wondering. In 2012, the Agency of Agriculture did the first sample collection looking for neonicotinoids and collected pollen. Nobody really knew what they were doing, probably including the lab, and nobody found anything. But more recently, UVM's taken it on, and we've been, the samples have been being, well, the beekeepers have been, we've been collecting samples, sending them to UVM. UVM's been sending the samples to the Cornell lab, which has a very low level of quantification. So the samples are much more accurately tested. And we've been finding out actually what our bees are truly exposed to. And I know Dr. Alger presented some of that information to you, and probably some of this information as well. So if you've already learned this about routes of exposure, I'll zip right through it fairly quickly. But what you have when corn is being planted, you have a dust cloud. The systemic pesticides get in the soil. They end up in the nectar and the pollen and the contagion fluid. And all of the routes, the planting dust and the contagion fluid can cause acute exposure. And by acute exposure, we're simply talking about bees dying very, very quickly. And so this right here is an air planter. And air planters are especially problematic because they use pneumatics to blow the seed down the tube to the ground, and the exhaust air from the planter gets vented to the outside, and it contains all the coating that wasn't tightly bound to the seed kernel. The seeds are just basically rolled in huge drums of that pesticide, and anything that didn't stick gets blown off into the air. And that dust coats the soil in the field, it drifts into adjacent fields, it coats plants and trees in adjacent fields, and any bees that are foraging across the field where it's being planted fly through the dust cloud and come in contact, and they die. So here's some bees that were flying through that cloud of dust that died. You can see they were collecting pollen, probably from dandelions because it's yellow, and usually the dandelions are blooming. Often they're blooming right in the cornfields as the corn is being planted and the bees are being foraged on it, and everything's being coated with dust. The plants that are near cornfields, typically you'll end up with levels around 9 parts per billion of neonics, and these are crops that were not seed treated. This is just accidental contamination. We tested some goldenrod and sent that in to UVM, and about 14% of those samples came back in field adjacent areas as having neonics in them. So in the fall, when the bees are foraging on goldenrod near crop fields, they're also being exposed at that time. The scary one to me is exposure through guttation fluid. And if you don't know what that is, that's simply sap from the plant that's being expressed out through pores in the plant, usually during the night. It's when there's a pressure differential between the atmosphere and the inside of the plant, and the plant weeps, basically. It happens usually when the plants are young and fairly tender. Also, dew can collect on the corn plants, or rainwater can collect in the little pocket formed by the corn leaf and the stem. And the levels of neonics in those droplets are astounding. So this is way more than a lethal dose. We're talking 47,000 parts per billion, 23,000 parts per billion, and 12,000 parts per billion. And that's imidacloprid, clothianidin, and thiamethoxam, which are 3 of the most toxic neonics and the most common used as seed treatments. So what happens when the bee forage on those droplets? Well, I can tell you a story of what it looks like to your colonies, because I had a mating yard where we raised queens, which had 200 small colonies. They're called mating nukes that are used for raising queen bees, and that's about 1/3 of our income for the year is raising queens. And we had an old farmer named Hudorfer who had about 120 acres of hayfield immediately adjacent to that mating yard. And he passed away, and it got bought by a large dairy who came in, and because it wasn't convenient, they just wanted to have to harvest at once. So they plowed up 120 acres and planted it into corn, which was all neonic treated. And that year, our mating nukes, which previously would get so strong that we'd have to remove brood out of them to keep them from getting crowded. Each time we caught queens, we'd have to pull out frames, move them to another box to keep them weak enough. We put them in strong, they looked good, and they went downhill for 6 weeks. And it wasn't until I started researching this guttation water that I realized it was a dry early summer, and the bees were foraging for water on the droplets on the corn plant that was immediately adjacent. They were bringing that, they honestly can't even bring it back because they die within about 5 minutes. And so the foragers were going out to collect water, which they use to feed the larvae, they use it to cool the hive, and they use it to dilute the brood food when they're feeding drones and they're feeding the queen and they're feeding the developing larvae. So they would go out, they wouldn't come back, and so the mating nukes just never built up. So that route of exposure to me is pretty scary and pretty insidious. And this is a study that was done by Tosi in 2017. And this is the time between them feeding on guttation droplets on field corn with one of 3 different treatments of neonics on it. And this is how many minutes it takes before what the scientist calls irreversible wing block. And what that means is complete paralysis. Okay, their wings seize up and they can't fly. The rest of the bee stops working too, but what they can observe when they do this is that the wings stop working, the bee can't fly. And you don't see it. The bee inspector wouldn't see it because these bees are dead out in the cornfield. They never make it back. And so all you know is that your colonies are getting weaker and weaker. So the time is anywhere from thiamethoxam, it's about 3 minutes. For imidacloprid, it's about 5.5. Okay, not a big difference. Doesn't matter to the bee. They're still dead. So those are the ways you can get acute exposure. So it's not like, when they used to spray malathion and you get a massive pile of dead bees in front of your hive. In these cases, the bees die out in the field and you never see them unless you go looking for them, then you do. What's much more common is chronic exposure. So this is what's often called sublethal.
Excuse me, I have to go to the dentist. I'd rather listen to you.
I'm not sure that's an endorsement. root canal. So the chronic exposure is low-level exposure over time. And this also happens with neonics. The most common way this happens is through pollen exposure with honeybees, foragers collecting pollen as a food source, and that pollen coming from a neonic treated plant. And so therefore it has residual levels of neonics in the pollen. It can also happen from collecting pollen from field adjacent plants or from collecting water from puddles of rainwater where the soil is contaminated with neonics. But it's not enough to immediately kill the bees. But it causes this host of other effects that all ultimately have an effect on the colony strength. And then we
I've just got a question.
Just a really,
Sorry.
no, it's okay, just a really quick question.
Yeah.
What's the average range of a colony of bees? So if you have a colony of bees.
Yep.
How far can they fly to get?
To go collect food.
Yeah,
Yeah, so they prefer to do most of their flying within 1 to 2 miles of their home,
okay,
but they can fly up to 5 miles. And what's really cool is they can actually do calculus better than high school students. And they can determine if there's a nectar source that has a certain percentage of sugar, but there's a more concentrated source of nectar, in other words, it has more sugar that's farther away. They can figure out if the additional sugar that will be burned while they fly that further distance is worth flying farther to get the more concentrated nectar, or if they should focus on the more dilute source that's nearby.
thank you. I never
Yes.
heard that.
So they fly amazing distances, which is also why I said at the beginning, the foragers are the ones who get it with trouble.
Right, yeah.
Yes,
Just follow up on that.
yes,
In aviation, there's a point called bingo fuel, where we're out on a mission. And
yes.
if you don't immediately do a 180, you're not gonna make it back. Do bees also calculate
Yes,
when they're out beyond?
yes,
your
and they
bingo
seem to do
time?
that by using landmarks. And so they navigate using the sun as a compass. So if you put a bee in a dark box for a couple of hours, they'll navigate based on where the sun was when they went in the box, not where it is now. And because they see UV light, they can navigate on cloudy days. But they can't navigate at night, so they stay home at night.
Interesting.
And the flowers don't tend to produce as much nectar during the night, so they forage mostly during the day. The other thing that they do is they can calculate how much they have a receptacle, sort of like the reticulum on a dairy cow, where the food goes without being digested. It's called the honey stomach. And they use it to transport the nectar back from the flowers that they're foraging on. But they also use it to take a little bit of honey from the hive with them as fuel, just like your men on a mission.
Reserve tank.
And they know how far they're flying because they know how far away that flower is that they're foraging on, and they'll bring just enough so that when they hit that flower where they're collecting nectar, they're empty. And they can refill the honey stomach completely full and bring it back. Because of course, once they've hit that nectar, they can consume that nectar on the flight home in order to power the flight to get back to the hive.
Amazing story.
It's pretty incredible.
Andrew, we have about 10 minutes just to let you,
Well, we're not gonna make it through everything, but I'll just keep going as fast as I can.
okay.
All right, so surface water, watersheds, the runoff, this isn't the puddles in the cornfields, but the streams and the rivers and the lakes in agricultural areas have significant levels of neonics as well. We'll talk about pollen exposure real quick here. This is the 2021 study results from UVM, which is the first year UVM did testing. They found neonics in several of the samples. And the most important thing here is when these pollen detections, these pesticide detections are hitting, mostly May and June, and then again in August. And if you compare that with the growth curve of a colony of honeybees, this is October, so this is the fall, and they kind of shrink down to maybe 7,000 or 8,000 winter bees. And then in the spring, they start building up again and reach a peak in June and July when there's all kinds of floral resources around. And they're being exposed right here when they're trying to grow. And again, right here in August, when they're trying to raise the bees that will make it through the winter. And so bees that are exposed to neonics at those 2 times, it's going to weaken the growth of the colony. Your colony will never get as big. And then again, the bees that are supposed to live through the winter will be weakened and more likely to die over the winter. This is the 2022 results. I'm sure Dr. Alger showed these to you as well. This is just an example of some of the levels we're finding in bee collected pollen. And the number of samples that had significant levels of neonics in pollen and in plant tissue. This is just pointing out, often if you get reps from the pesticide industry in here, they'll be talking about LD50s. That's the dose that'll kill half of the bees. And what we're really concerned about here is the lowest observable effect concentration, which if you just look is incredibly much smaller. That's the level at which honeybee colonies start to develop adverse effects. And we'll just use the rest of our time to go through some of those adverse effects because they're pretty amazing. What you have here, this one is from 2016. And what you've got, again, all of these studies I pulled out because these are levels that we are seeing in our beehives in Vermont, in the pollen that's coming in. These are levels of neonics that were used. We have bees that start doing bizarre things about twice as often. We have bees that are spending spending less time at the top of the hive and much more time at the bottom of the hive. So they're just hanging around at the bottom of the hive and not actually doing any work. They're not storing nectar in the frames. They're not feeding a larva. They tend to fall more often. They can't climb up the hive and they fail to navigate towards the light. We were talking about how they navigate. They lose that ability to navigate towards the light by a measure of about 35%.
Sounds like a nursing home.
Exactly. The bees are going senile and all they did was eat some pollen. So here we have more cumulative mortality. And basically the dark ones are the ones that were hit with either 4 parts per billion or 8 parts per billion of neonics. The open circles are the controls. You can see we're losing most of the bees at 30 days instead of somewhere between 50 and 60 days. So they have, half the lifespan. And so you're trying to raise a colony of bees, you're trying to make them healthy, produce a honey crop, get them through the winter, and your bees are only living half as long. This study shows basically limited forage activity. The amount that they're foraging, this is number of flights in an hour to a particularly nice group of flower. And the open triangles are the ones that are the controls, and the dark ones are the neonic exposed bees. And it's over 100 fewer foraging flights per hour after they've been exposed to neonics. This is the distance they can fly. So they call it a locomotor deficit. This is the amount they can travel. Interestingly, the neonics show a drastic reduction. They can go less than half as far. Fipronil, which is a completely different class of pesticides, it's not a neonic. Actually, the bees that have been hit with that go farther. Who knew? But the neonics, the bees can only travel about half as far. Same thing here. This is imidacloprid. And these bees here have been exposed to neonics. The control is up here, and these 2 lines have been exposed to incredibly low levels of neonics. And what's happened here is the bees that have been hit with 0.04, this is nanograms per bee, which is roughly per billion. So 0.04 parts per billion or 0.4 parts per billion, which are well under the levels we're seeing in the hives, have lost their sense of smell. And that's how they communicate. They communicate by pheromones in the hive, and that's how they locate floral resources in the field. And then we'll hit this, and then if we've run out of time, we'll call it good, because the synergistic effects is what's most scary. So I showed you this at the beginning with the varroa mites. And the viruses that they carry, this is a varroa mite, which has transmitted deformed wing virus to a bee. And this is what can happen if you don't keep your mites under control. Is they larvae develop and become adults that can't fly. But what is really scary is if we have a colony that has neither mites nor neonics. This is the type of symptoms that if they have only neonics, they start getting a few more deformed wing symptoms because, of course, if there's no mites, they can't get the virus, right? If they only have the mites, the level goes up slightly. But when they're exposed to neonics and there's a virus present, it jumps about 20% in terms of the number of bees that are afflicted with the virus. So the exposure to the neonics weakens the bee's ability to deal with the viruses. And you end up with a much larger number of bees in the colony having symptoms. Same thing here, but this is the outlier at the top is if they're both exposed to Nosema and a neonicotinoid. Same thing. The multiplier effect is very strong.
I want to ask this question because I know
Yeah.
we're running out of time and you're gonna be kicked out of here.
Yeah.
So, given that neonicotinoids persist in the environment what seemingly is many years after application,
Yep,
it might
2 to 20.
it might be a while until we see the numbers come back down again, should we ban this product. Are there places in the world where we have a good track record of outlawing this practice and seeing the numbers come back?
Yeah, so on the continent, the place that did it the longest ago is Quebec.
Okay,
And they did it in 2019. They went from 99% of the corn being treated with neonicotinoids to 0.5% of the corn being treated with neonicotinoids. And talking with Quebec beekeepers, at about year 4, they started seeing an improvement in honeybee health. And, the next year it was even better. So I think it's an extremely valid point that you bring up, and it's a caution that I try to share with people is you can't expect magical results because it's taken us years to get into this mess. It's going to take a number of years to get out. And it is also not the only causative factor, but it's a huge one.
Mhm.
And so by eliminating this, hopefully over time, the levels in the soil will drop down so that the levels expressed in the nectar and the pollen will drop, and the honeybees will have more resistance to the other factors that can impact their health.
Thank you.
Yeah, very much.
So we should probably wrap up.
Yeah.
I was gonna suggest that, I don't know what else we haven't seen, so if we want to coordinate another visit at some point, we can do that. Also, if you could, or maybe you've already done this, get the presentation somehow electronically into
I can share it with Sidonia.
Sidonia's, yeah, great, and then she'll post it so that we can all.
Sure, that's great. And we actually made it almost all the way through. There was just a section, which I'll just summarize here, which was the effects of the neonics on the queen bees, which is simply to say it causes them to lay about half as many eggs. It causes about half of them to die within 4 weeks. And it causes about half of the eggs that are laid to be infertile. It has similar effects on the drones. So as someone who raises queen bees for sale, that's huge. But a queen is the mother of the entire colony. So if you have unhealthy queens, you can't possibly have healthy colonies. And then the last slide has all the sources for the scientific studies that I shared. So if any of you, want to check that out, that's all I can.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And if you have time for questions, I'm happy to stay and take them. But if not,
Does anybody have a burning question that you feel a bit better to ask right now for all of our benefits?
I just wondered if there's any science now on, in the beginning that all those 4 things are attacking colonies. And so adding like this science, this synergistic science you just talked about, to climate change, like last summer, so much rain and the heavy freeze we had in May, or for that habitat loss. So just that stress on bees has to have a cumulative effect.
It does, and what you end up seeing, you can basically summarize the first two. If you're not trying to legislate about them, they affect the bees in the same way, which is nutrition. And nutrition is the foundation of health. So anything that affects the nutrition that the bees are receiving is going to have negative consequences. And I didn't spend a lot of time on those because I know everybody's already trying to work on climate change, and there's not a whole lot that can be done, right here to a global problem. Yeah.
Appreciate you pulling all of that together for us. It's helpful, and I think builds on the conversations we've had, so far previously, and reinforces some of that. Probably leaves us with new questions too.
Yeah.
So, great, thank you.
You're very welcome. And if you have any further questions or need any further information, I'm always happy to come back or answer questions by email.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, folks, for having me.
All right, we can stop this session.